I think we're in a very rare moment historically of a severe crisis, the sort of crisis that historians would call a general crisis, meaning it's not confined to one sector. It's not only an economic crisis or only an ecological crisis or only a political crisis, but it's all of that rolled into one. So it's a crisis that is engulfing the whole social order. Now, I think that what lies at the bottom of this crisis are some deep irrationalities that are hardwired into our social structure, which is a capitalist social structure. But familiar views of capitalism focus one-sidedly on its economic dimension, and they would generally direct our attention to looking at the economic aspect of the crisis.
You're talking about a Marxist critique.
Exactly. Marxist or social democratic, left-wing theories derived from Marx and in softer or harder forms, let's say. The problem is those theories have tended to be too economy focused. They haven't been expanded to take in other crisis tendencies, other contradictory and perverse aspects of capitalism, those which lead it periodically to ecological crises, to social crises, and to political crises. So what my book does is try to develop a different and larger view of what capitalism is that shows how it is primed, hardwired to generate not just periodic economic crises, but general crises of the sort we're facing now, which also include these other dimensions.
Okay, so let's talk about these other dimensions and the crises that are contained there, and then I just want to go a little bit deeper into how these different sectors and which make up this general crisis, how they essentially broadly constitute capitalism. But let's start with these various sectors. I guess we could start with the economy. Outline for us the crisis that we have in this economy.
Well, I would say overall, understood in the most human way, which is the way we should be thinking about it, it's a massive deterioration in the conditions of life that the overwhelming majority of people on the planet are facing, either because their livelihoods are imperiled, because the work does not pay a living wage, certainly not a wage on which you could support a family. And so people are driven into debt, and that creates a whole new wonderful set of profit opportunities for now not the manufacturers, but for the banking and financial sector. So we've had the offshoring of production to low-wage regions. We've had the weakening of unions, which were the only institutions that, in our country managed to support the claims of working people for decent wages. We've got the precarization of work. No more like lifelong secure jobs, that you could build a life with some predictability around. Jobs that can disappear in a flash and that usually get replaced by even more insecure, precarious, and even less well-paid jobs. So people are having to moonlight. You have to cobble together an income based on a whole set of different streams, different family members contributing if you have a family with more than one adult. And, it's kind of a big hot mess for the majority of people who do not have independent sources of family wealth or property ownership. And this is the case in the United States, which has always thought of itself as a relatively wealthy country. But think about the other parts of the world that have never thought of themselves as wealthy and that are equally suffering from being more or less expelled from the official circuits of economic exchange and production. More and more people are thrust outside of all that without much hope of ever finding a way in. It's from an economic point of view, it's a mess.
Okay, and let's talk about social reproduction, and just for those who aren't familiar with the term, explain to us what social reproduction is, and how in this era where it's in crisis.
Exactly. I think people who may not know this technical term, social reproduction, will know what I'm talking about if I talk about a crisis of care or a care crunch. We hear a lot about family work imbalance and so on. Now, what I've just said about the crisis of work, that all pertains to paid work. But there's a whole nother fund of work that's absolutely essential in a capitalist society, which is largely unpaid. And that is the work of care or social reproduction. That is the birthing, the raising, the socializing of children, the new generations of workers. It's the replenishing and restoring of existing workers who have to be fed and cleaned and rested and so on in order to continue work. It's care for the elderly, for community, family, and friends. Now, that work has traditionally been done, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, by women. It's gendered work. Care, that's a feminine thing, supposedly, in our way of thinking. But nowadays, women have been drawn into the paid workforce, partly because of what I said before, the destruction of the idea of a family wage in which a man, let's say, could earn enough to support the whole family without a working wife. Okay, that kind of system is gone. And instead, women's wage work is essential, both for the profit makers, for the corporate sector, which needs it, and for the families who rely on that income. Well, that means that the time, the energy, and so on that was required before for this contribution, this essential contribution in care work, is being siphoned off to the corporate sector, to the profit sector. And add to that there's been pressure from investors on states, on governments, to cut back social spending. All this talk about the deficit and so on. So we have the contraction of social services at just the moment when women have less time to devote to care work privately. All of the state supports for care in the form of daycare, childcare, elder care, healthcare, all of these things are under pressure. It's a perfect storm of social reproductive crisis. Where is the energy? Where is the time? Where is the revenue that's going to support this going to come from?
Where do we see the implications? I mean, is that we have children that maybe are entering into a school with more of a vocabulary deficit, or we're seeing people who are having to go into nursing homes before maybe prematurely because there is no ability to care for them at home. Where do we see, where does this manifest itself in terms of certainly, I mean, I understand the concept of the stress that's associated with it, but where do we see those outcomes?
Well, frankly, in a whole lot of ways, I think even, although this might, I couldn't spell this out quickly, I think even in decline in life expectancy, actually, in certain sectors of the population because of, just being socially cut off, let's say, not being touched even, things like that. But also just think about the institutional side of this. Look at what goes on in nursing homes, in hospitals, in schools. huge class size in schools because we're not putting the money into that. I just had a friend who had a hip replacement who, at one of the premier hospitals in New York City, who actually spent the night on a gurney in a hallway because they didn't have a bed for him. This kind of stuff is happening more and more. Nurses have caseloads that exceed their capacity to actually do their job. This is all part of this crisis of care, because care is not only done in the private home or in the community, but also in these institutions that require public support as well as private investments of time and energy.
You write too that we're facing a crisis of the environment. I think that's hopefully people are, it's self-explanatory. I mean, I think that hopefully the people understand that one third of Pakistan was underwater recently. We've had massive drought for years out in the west coast of this country. We've seen it, we can see it everywhere. I mean, around the world. Well, talk about the crisis in the context of politics that we're facing.
I think there are two dimensions of this. One is that a capitalist economy, in order to function the way it's supposed to, requires public powers. It requires public goods, infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, and now, as we know, a broadband. And we've even talked about the care infrastructure, which was discussed a while back in the Congress. It requires regulatory capacity, right? Because, capitalists need sometimes to be disciplined for their own good. They would often put their thirst for short-term profit over a longer-term sustainable economic system. So it's kind of like Ulysses. You have to tie them to the mast so that they won't destroy their own profit system. So what I'm saying then is that, hang on a second, I've sort of lost my thread here. So
we have two aspects of our crisis in politics:
regulatory capacity and public good infrastructure. At least there are other things too. Legitimacy, credibility. I mean, think about the Supreme Court now, the possibility of its loss of legitimacy. So there's a tendency to hollow out the public powers that the system needs because corporations and investors don't want to pay for it. They don't want to pay the taxes that all of this requires to support it. And they want to capture the regulatory agencies, put their own lobbyists in there. We know about the revolving door, people who work in the public agencies and then leave and go right back to corporate jobs, the very corporations they were supposed to be overseeing, right? So there's regulatory capture, and there is essentially the loss of legitimacy. All of this means that we actually don't have the public powers that we need to rein in corporate power. And if we don't have that at the national level, we certainly don't have it at the transnational and global level, because after all, we have problems that can't be solved at the national level. We have some problems that require larger public powers, climate change, public health in an age of pandemic, and so on and so forth. So, and we don't have the public powers there that the investors, the mega corporations, they know how to offshore and jurisdiction shop. They find ways to escape the state powers that try to constrain them. And out there, beyond the states, it's a no man's land where they can sort of do what they want. So that's one aspect, but there's also a second, and this I would call, to use another technical term, the hegemonic dimension of crisis, meaning loss of legitimacy, loss of credibility. When governance doesn't work, when people feel their governments can't solve their problems or won't solve their problems, even if they could, then they start to lose faith in the system and they start looking for alternatives. That's the situation we're in now, I think, politically. It's why the mainstream public parties have lost a lot of their support. It's why people are gravitating to more radical, even out of the box ways of thinking. In some cases, those out of the box ways of thinking are actually promising and could lead to a what I would call a progressive or an emancipatory restructuring of the system, which I'd be all in favor of. But plenty of the alternatives that people are trying out today are really noxious.
And if you look internationally, I think we're I mean, as well as in this country, there's a pretty pronounced trend towards that more noxious version of authoritarianism and revanchism that we're seeing across the globe. All right, so those are the areas in which we're facing these crises, and we should say that these crises are also from the perspective of the capitalist system. They're crises that we're not observing these crises as a critique of capitalism as much as it is it's a problem that even for capitalism itself, we should say. I mean, that's the cannibalistic quality of this. It's almost like beyond cannibalism when the snake starts eating its own tail on some level.